Many thanks, Mr. Chairman. As Collins just alluded to, it's a great opportunity to fanfare the 2014 crop, because in many cases, I realise not in all cases, that there are a large number of record crops and a number over 100 tonnes per hectare on farm. So what I'd like to do, and I'll try and keep it brief, is to highlight some of the facts and the figures backed up by some of the BBRO's own data to highlight why and where we've managed to achieve such a record crop in 2014. So I think as we reflect back on the whole season, I think we can all probably appreciate it was particularly kind. Quentin's just highlighted about the carrot story. Well, the conditions that were boosting carrot production were doing exactly the same for sugar beet production, and that really lasted right through the season. And the great news about the sugar beet sort of productivity on UK farms when you compare it to cereals and oilseeds is it continues to improve year on year, and 2014 is no different to and continues that trend into the future. So what I'll touch on briefly, weather was instrumental and key to the success of many of the crops. Briefly touch on varieties and the BBRO BSPB recommended list and some of the data from that. But also what we do appreciate, again linked to weather, that sowing conditions in 2014 were off the back of a very kind winter period and early spring, which made conditions ideal for sowing and early emergence. But I'm also quite mindful of the fact that it wasn't ideal for all. And this photograph, I think, highlights, this is a photograph I took around about the 25th of May, and you'll notice that's incredibly patchy emergence. Now, the reason for that was, although the winter was kind, we did not have a lot of frost or weathering or frost mold, which provided some challenges for you to try and generate some seed beds, particularly in the berry factory area, but also around the wash, which I was conscious about as well. But we also had, in certain localities, very little rain, incredibly dry, and for that period, we were getting a two-stage emergence, and it's spot the seedling. When you think we're already at a sort of a 6-8 leaf stage next to seeds that are only 50 centimetres away, are only just starting to emerge at that part of the season. So although most crops got ideal conditions, it wasn't the same for everybody. And going back to those same fields, and this is one I took a photograph at the same location in October, those late emerging beet certainly didn't catch up or generate the yield that we would have hoped to have been the situation. And what's also interesting, part of my fungicide research at the BBRO, we were looking at about timing and interaction and applying it to different canopies. So we actually generated a trial where we sowed 3 different parts of the trial. The drilling dates are on the left-hand side. So we sowed part of the trial on the 27th of March. The second part of the trial went in on the 10th of April, and the final part went in on the 28th of April. Now, we all know that the later you drill, the impact it has on yield. So this is not rocket science or something new. But in relation to the 2014 situation, if you look at this part of the trial data, remember it's one site, one location, 1 year, it's quite clear that the crops that went in on the 27th of March, which was about average date or median date, we've managed to achieve, in the absence of a fungicide, 105 adjusted tonnes per hectare. The midpoint drilling, we're looking at 93 tonnes adjusted, and the latest sown part of the trial has actually yielded 75 adjusted. So just by 30 days difference in drilling, we've lost 30 tonnes. It's almost 1 tonne a day for delaying drilling. So really emphasising the point that it's important when the conditions are right to ensure that we get that crop in the ground, barring other issues related to weather. As I said, crop growth and crop yield progression developed as we went through the season. I'll touch this on again. The importance of crop protection is significant, and then we'll finally end up on harvesting conditions. So this is the 2014 list. You'd have seen this 18 months ago when you came to the BBRO Summer Open Days at the 4 factories. These are the varieties you bought way back in 2013 that were delivered on farm at this time 12 months ago and were sown on the farm that have actually given you the yield performance that you've just experienced. Now, the reason I put this slide is that we are continually developing, evaluating a number of new varieties against the existing varieties that the seed houses are producing. And we're also comparing that in various trials. So we run 13 variety trials on different locations, on different soil types, and then comparing that to the national yield of the 115,000 hectares that we have. So if you look at this particular chart, and this is where it's really exciting and how we're continuing to push sugar beet yields in the UK conditions. The mean of those variety trials that we lifted, and we lifted 9, actually yielded, in that period between September and the end of November, the equivalent of 120 tonnes a hectare adjusted. That's the highest we've ever produced. And actually, within some of those trials, the most highest yielding plots were yielding over 160 tonnes per hectare, really showing the potential of this crop under our conditions. Now, I know from Debbie's presentation this morning, we face the challenges of not having the ideal weather conditions potentially Lille has or other parts of Central Europe. But it just say if the conditions favour, the tools and the technologies we're adopting are continuing to push that yield. The other good news is that the commercial crop that you've grown is probably going to generate a record yield. The factories are still running at somewhere around just short of 80 adjusted tonnes, which beats the record from a couple of years ago. And if you then look at that information, then look at all the other years, you can then put it in context and see how we continue to drive forward yield. We can look at that as well in the equivalent of sugar, tonnes per hectare, and again, the same sort of story, and the good news that we are able to highlight and demonstrate, and the benefits of the 2014 season when you compare it across previous last 10 years. So we're getting things right, but as I said, weather has certainly played its role in the season. And if you then compare the yields from 2005 through to 2014, what we've got here, the red line represents the recommended list trial performance on a sugar tonnes per hectare against the commercial crop. You actually see it's quite when you look at the trend line, around about a 30% differential between what we're seeing in the yield trials and what we're seeing in commercial crops. Hasn't changed too much, but it just shows the potential, what we do have, and what we could achieve as we go forward. The good news, it's still going up, so there's greater yields to come as we go into the future. Now, I've touched on weather. That is a particularly gloomy weather forecast for Monday, but the factors from the weather that we experienced, and this is looking at the weather pattern from the Met Office for East Anglia, and what is really quite clear from this is that just how mild it was through the March, April and May period, almost in some cases double the average that we'd normally experience. And really there was only 1 month where we were below the average, which was August, which sadly coincided with the children being off, but actually had some implications potentially on growth in that particular period. But a very warm year. If we then look at rainfall, another key driver for the benefit of the crop, you'll notice that we've got some quite extremes to that period. So if you remember this time last year, January and February was very wet, even in the eastern side of the country, almost twice the amount of rainfall just prior to putting in spring crops. We then had a very kind March and April period where it provided a very good conditions for developing those seed beds where we could and getting the crop in. And really what was also key throughout the summer months was that the crop was under very little water deficit. We did seem to have regular, although occasionally patchy in its nature, supply of rain that enabled the crop to continue to grow throughout the summer. September, you'll notice, is another dry month. That did cause some problems for early lifting, but once we then got into October and November, again, it was mild and relatively wet, which then once we started in earnest to get the beet into the factory, enabled better conditions for delivery at the 4 factories. Now, one or two metrics from the season. This is the drilling date from the specific crop survey. You'll notice that each colour represents a different year. Along the x-axis is dates, and on the y it's percentage of surveyed area. If you just look at the 2014, the red dots, you'll notice it wasn't the earliest of years. Well, what was particularly of note from the last season was just how sigmoidal that is, how tight it is. No interruptions. You did not have to suffer too many issues. So the crop went in the ground really very quickly. When you look at some of the other seasons, for example, 2010, we started reasonably well, and obviously there's a weather interruption. There's a check in getting that crop into the ground. And the issues that then has on implications for herbicide management and also establishment of the crop, which ultimately can have an impact. Looking at the plant population as well, we know from all the historic work, previous work that a number of us have done before, we're looking to establish between 80 and 100,000 plants per hectare, and the BBR have been encouraging you to establish 100,000 plants per hectare to ensure that you've got a uniform population, which is now we have the whole beet harvesting, which is making for ease of lifting, but it's good for weed control as well. You'll notice if you look at the 2014 data, just how fewer crops were getting less than 80,000 plants per hectare, and a lot hitting that sort of optimum 80 to 100,000 plants per hectare, although there are still some outside that from both sets of data. And because we had kind conditions, this is a photograph from several years ago, but it's pertinent to the 2014 season because it's just looking at a couple of other seasons, and 2014 was very similar to 2011. Good start, good growing conditions, and canopy development. So those two crops in 2011 and 2012 were drilled within 48 hours of each other, and the photograph was taken on the same day, the 8th of June. And going back to Debbie's talk earlier, it's all about light interception. And when you see what sort of size of canopy we had in 2011 compared to 2012, then it's only meaning one thing. You're intercepting that light. It's all about photosimulation and building yield and canopy as fast as possible to deliver further yield into the future. You've seen this slide earlier from today. That's exactly what happened in many cases. And when we're seeing in the UK crop almost full canopy expansion by the end of May, that is a really positive message, again, to boost yield and to ensure that we're delivering excellent yield potential for the future. We also, again, from the digs that were undertaken through the August period to get an indication of how the crop was growing, this is looking at the mid-August yield progression, and you'll notice if you look at the 2014, already by that period, we had achieved around 8 tons of sugar by hectare, again reflecting the kindness of the season. And if you also then look at the rate of yield increase between August and factory opening, you'll notice we're around about 1 to 1.1 tons a week on yield increase, although if you look and compare 2014 to 2013, it's not as high as probably what one would have expected. And I think the reason why we're seeing a slight reduction in that bar compared to the others, although the line is going in the right direction, is it's going back to the weather. I've already highlighted the 1 month that didn't actually do what we wanted it to do was that August period. And that's had a direct influence on potential sugar accumulation because of the lack of sunlight. Now, we've talked about crop growth and developing the canopy and plant populations. What's also critical is making sure that the varieties are doing what they're supposed to be doing, so tackling the issues of rhizomania and beet cyst nematode. But what we're also particularly conscious of at the beginning, around about this time last year, because we had had very few frosts, a lot of the aphids that are potentially going to carry the virus into the crop had managed to survive, and so the virus yellows forecast, which I'll show in a moment, was very high. The warm spring soils would also favour, again, the nematodes and the vectors of the soil-borne diseases. And what we've also noticed, and this is one of the issues that partly we're still seeing a little bit about, is that because it was particularly warm through September and October, right through to Christmas, along with the soil moisture, I think some of the issues that we've started to work on, things like violet root rot, have seemed to have a greater impact on a number of farms. We're starting to see it in newer areas we haven't seen it, and we're also starting to see it increase in its severity in known hotspot areas. And that's something we are working on. We're developing a method, and one of the projects that was highlighted in the posters that we need to continue to develop. So if you look at the virus yellows forecast that I'm sure many of you saw in the weekly BBRO bulletins that went out back in March, the risk was because the mean temperature for the different factories was about 3 degrees warmer than the previous year, about 2.5 degrees warmer than the national long-term average. And in the absence of the neonicotinoids, and in this case, as we all know, we use them as targeted seed treatments applied to the seed. Without those seed treatments, we were looking at somewhere between 50 and 80% of the national crop at risk of going down with virus yellows, and the potential yield loss of somewhere between 25 and 50% if that actually came to fruition. You can see that seed treatments are adopted widely. Not only is it controlling aphids, but around another 15 different soil pests and other foliar chewing insects as well. And where they are used, you're looking at potentially 1 to 2.6% of the crop going down with virus yellows. In reality, it was less than 1%, which is good news. But as I said, we are continually looking for alternatives, new ways of tackling these problems, and that's why flying the flag this morning of the new UK Innovate project, looking at new integrated approaches to virus yellows, is very important for the future as well. Now, if there's one thing that we've done to the UK crop to protect it and promote yield performance and maintain that canopy, is the use of fungicides. And they've made a step change, as we all know, in the last 10 years. And I think this, again, from the specifics field survey, and I touched on this morning again, having the metrics, particularly when trying to provide evidence-based information, science-based information for the Anderson's report, and also the AHDB report on the impact of product loss potentially through the European Union. It just shows you what we've been doing and how practice has changed on the basis of BBRO knowledge and information. And now you can see that most of the crop will receive at least one fungicide, and depending on the numbers of the length of time the crop's in the ground, then we've certainly seen a 1, 2, and sometimes a 3 spray benefit. So you saw that again this morning, really excellent control where we've applied fungicides. What was particularly noticeable about the 2014 season, and has been now for the last 3 or 4 years, is that rust is a key player and seems to have overtaken powdery mildew as our #1 disease under UK conditions. Now, I think that's partly because some of the varieties have an Achilles heel and they are more susceptible in some instances to rust. But also, the weather conditions in August need to be warm and dry, and we've had a run of situations where that hasn't happened, and so they've not been quite as conducive for its development. We actually saw rust starting to develop in the second week of June, which is really very, very early. And fungicides played a key role in protecting the crop, keeping the diseases out, but also then providing an excellent, healthy canopy to continue to photosynthesize through the season, and then also the benefits of leaf retention for early frost protection for the early part of the season. And that was a photograph I took, Debbie used this morning with regard to the story. This is the BBRO trial at Garbaldersham. No fungicide spray on this side in one of the plots. We've lost over 50% of leaf cover because of the impact of the disease. 2 spray applications, healthier, darker green, lots of canopy, continuing to photosynthesize right into the autumn. And interestingly, when you start to look at the monthly assessments that we make on disease development, we've been looking at different spray timings. You can see in the untreated, from the mid-August, September and October. In the untreated, the level of rust built through August and part of September. Actually, once you get back to October, because we've lost the leaf, there's no leaves there to assess to count rust. So actually, it's dropped back. You can then see the benefits of the different spray strategies we've been looking at. The 1 spray, obviously checking it early, starting to build. The 3 spray early in this particular case. The first application went on in June before label recommendation, but we're again building on some of the previous knowledge, looking at applying the product before symptom expression, but knowing that those spores are coming into the crop 2, 3, 4 weeks beforehand, and seeing if we can benefit from that. And in the 3 spray late, that we started a program at disease onset end of August and then end of September. And if you look at the first yield data, because we've had a very early canopy development, you can see from the untreated, we produced 114 adjusted tons. The 1 spray strategy produced a further 10 adjusted tons on top of that. The 2 spray strategy has given 131.5 tons, and the 3 spray early, in this particular year, we don't often see, or can not necessarily always see a benefit from this, but because canopy development was early and there was disease there, although it's not statistically different from the 2 spray strategy at this situation, it's yielded another 3 adjusted tons over the 2 spray strategy. And then finally, the 3 spray late, actually you get this drop back in this particular situation compared to the 2 spray strategy, but often this comes into its own after Christmas by keeping sugar content high, and we'll wait to get the final data from the other part of the trial where we lift later. We've just lifted those second part of the trials in Lincolnshire and Norfolk. So clearly showing a 20-ton difference by using the fungicides in this particular season. So in summary, and minding of the time, weather has been a major contributory factor. You know, the comments that were coming out of the Met Office at the end of last year, saying it was the warmest year on record, very kind conditions, excellent growing conditions, rapid growth and yield progression, and that has clearly manifested itself in the varietal performances. As I said, close to 80 adjusted tons per hectare. And in the BBRO trials, you know, it's superb to be able to say we're getting trial plots in excess of 160 adjusted tons. Timely pest and disease control has had its benefits as well, and a key factor for keeping it clean and healthy and keeping the canopy intact for photosynthesis. And harvest conditions, hard at first with the dry conditions, but relatively kind since, although we appreciate there has been some wet conditions, and there has been probably more root rots in certain fields than we would anticipate, but again, partly favoured by some of the conditions that we've been experiencing. So all in all, a good news story, and we wish you well for the 2015 season, and let's hope that conditions remain kind, and that we're able to get the new crop in the ground under favourable situation. We'll start to make sure that the BBRO weekly bulletins issue the relevant information as you need, and one of the early ones, of course, will be the Virus Yellows forecast that will be issued in the first week in March. But it's also an opportunity to today flag up the summer open days and the new demonstration sites that the BBRO will be running in 2015 as well. So there'll be the 4 open days, 12th, 14th, 19th and 21st of May. And the final comment we'll make is that the BBRO reference book that you all received a copy of in the post 12 months ago, we've updated that, refreshed that, and there'll be a new one in the post very shortly. So many thanks for your attention. So a very quick summary of the benefits that hopefully you've all seen. And many thanks for your attention. If there's a quick question or two, I'll do my best to answer. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any very quick questions? If there's no questions, Mark's going to be here afterwards, so when we all go through for coffee, I think that's probably more appropriate. I'd just like to summarise very briefly. I'm conscious you're all interested in a cup of tea and getting into the car. thank everybody for coming, first of all. It's very important. If you please could remember to fill out the forms on exit, that would be really helpful. And there'll also be a feedback survey sent round again, if that can be filled out. I'd like to thank our speakers on the platform for this afternoon session, finally, formally, so thank you all again. Thank you for that. And wish, as Mark says, you all a successful season. One final thing, I'd just like to thank, I don't know if Ruth's still here, but Ruth Digby, who is moving on in her role as Chief Sugar Advisor. Ruth's been a great help to us at the BBRO and British Sugar and NFU, so I'd like to wish her well. Okay, safe journey home, and thank you for attending. Thank you.